A 27-year-old female teacher unexpectedly fell in love with a boy 12 years younger than her. This boy was also her student. However, this forbidden love, which should have been condemned by society, moved countless viewers to tears after watching the movie. Takao and Yukino first met on a rainy morning because Takao liked rainy days. He would skip class every time it rained and go to the park. There, he would enjoy the peace that the rain brought. The pavilion in the center of the park was the place he always came to when he skipped class. But today, there was a woman in the pavilion. She was a mature and beautiful woman in professional attire, yet neither of them spoke to each other. Takao, holding a manuscript, quietly observed Yukino. Yukino had chocolate and beer for breakfast, which made Takao feel very strange. But soon, he realized that he seemed to have seen this woman somewhere before, so Takao couldn't help but ask her if they had met somewhere before. Yukino said they had never met. She initially thought it was just a cheesy pickup line from Takao, but when she saw the school badge on his clothes, she froze for a moment, because it was the same school where she worked. She then told Takao that maybe they had indeed met, but just as Yukino was about to leave, she suddenly muttered, "A faint clap of thunder, clouded skies. Perhaps rain comes. If so, will you stay here with me?" After leaving behind this somewhat cryptic poem, Yukino left the place. Takao didn't understand what the poem meant, but this was the beginning of their story. Takao's family situation was far from ideal, which made him more mature than his peers. He began to take care of his family from an early age. Meanwhile, his mother chose to run away from home and start living with a boyfriend 12 years younger than her. His older brother was also about to start a life with his girlfriend next month. What used to be a warm family suddenly became just Takao on his own. Usually, Takao would go to school like an ordinary student, but he always felt like he didn't belong there. He longed for rainy days, as if only the pavilion in the rainy park was his true home. Little did he know, his fate had already started to intertwine with Yukino's. Today, he met Yukino again. This was their second encounter. This time, there was no awkwardness between them like the first meeting. Instead, they greeted each other warmly. Just like last time, Yukino was drinking beer paired with chocolate, but Takao couldn't remain calm. He kept stealing glances at Yukino's beautiful feet, and even started drawing them in his notebook. Then, unexpectedly, Yukino began to speak to Takao. She asked him why he didn't go to class, but Takao didn't answer her. Instead, he asked her why she hadn't gone to work. Yukino casually replied that she had skipped work. Then she took out a pile of chocolate from her bag and asked Takao if he wanted some. This was their first conversation, but surprisingly, it was incredibly smooth. It felt as though they had been old friends for years. By noon, Takao stood up to say goodbye. He told Yukino that he only skipped morning classes on rainy days. By noon, he had to go back to school, but Yukino felt that they might meet again, perhaps on the next rainy day. What Takao didn't know was that Yukino, just like him, skipped work on rainy mornings and came to this pavilion in the park. In the days that followed, every time it rained, they would meet in the pavilion. But this became the happiest time for Takao and Yukino, because two lonely souls were drawing closer to each other. From getting to know each other to becoming familiar, unconsciously, Takao began to open up to Yukino. He told her that his dream was to become a shoemaker. This was the first time Takao had ever shared his dream with anyone. Gradually, a subtle feeling began to quietly grow in Takao's heart. Every morning, the moment he woke up, he longed for rainy days, but at the same time, Takao knew deep down, Yukino's world was far too distant from his own. To 15-year-old Takao, Yukino was merely an older woman, but even so, he still hoped for rainy days, just to meet her again. As time passed, their relationship became closer. They even reached the point where they could share lunch. But this also led Takao to an unexpected discovery. Yukino's cooking skills seemed to be rather poor, and Yukino seemed to realize this as well. She shyly handed Takao a bottle of water and asked him not to make fun of her. But what Takao didn't know was that Yukino's cooking was so bad because she had temporarily lost her sense of taste due to illness. She could only taste the beer and chocolate. But today, Yukino could sense a new taste. That was the lunch Takao made for her. Yukino had no one to confide in, so she called her ex-boyfriend to share the happiness. The voice on the other end was as gentle as always, but Yukino knew very well that during her illness, this man had cruelly abandoned her. And now, the person by her side was a 15-year-old boy, a stranger to her. Yet Yukino hadn't realized that, without knowing when, She too had begun to look forward to rainy days, to repay Takao for the lunch he made her during this time. Yukino gave him a gift. It was a book about handcrafted shoemaking. This was a book Takao had always dreamed of owning, but its expensive price had kept it out of his reach. In that moment, he could no longer suppress his feelings. He made up his mind, and boldly spoke the thoughts he had long kept hidden inside. He told her that he wanted to make a pair of shoes for her. Of course, Yukino understood what this meant, but she didn't refuse him. Takao's presence seemed like a warm ray of sunshine, shining on her lonely soul. She didn't know when it had started. Yukino had also begun to feel something different for the boy before her. Takao carefully measured Yukino's feet with both hands, and this was the first time he had ever touched a woman's feet. The atmosphere between them began to grow intimate. Behind the dark clouds, sunlight gradually started to peek through. It was as though it was telling them that the rain would soon stop. Takao measured Yukino's feet carefully. His tenderness felt like the sunshine after the rain, so gentle that Yukino felt as though the air around them was filled with warmth. Yukino cooperated quietly with him, gazing at the gentle boy before her. In this moment, Yukino unexpectedly couldn't help but speak out her inner sorrow. Takao looked at Yukino, filled with sadness, and he remained silent, because he knew almost nothing about Yukino, not her profession, her age, or even her name. Takao wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know where to begin. At that moment, Takao's heart felt as though it were tightly gripped by a large hand. But despite this, Takao was still deeply drawn to Yukino, unable to resist the feelings he was experiencing. But the long rainy season always comes to an end. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. This left Yukino with a feeling of emptiness in her heart. She kept trying to comfort herself, thinking that it might be better this way. That way, Takao wouldn't have any excuse to skip class. He could focus on his studies, and she herself should return to a normal life. Yet, for some reason, she would always find herself unknowingly returning to that park. The park on sunny days felt strange to Yukino. This year, the summer had seen little rain. There was still no rain until the arrival of summer vacation. To save up for university, Takao was almost constantly working, but aside from working tirelessly every day, his happiest moments were when he would make shoes for Yukino after work. Unknowingly, it had been 2 months since they last met. During this time, Yukino would often visit the park's pavilion on sunny days, drinking beer. Both of them were eagerly waiting for a rainy day, but fate seemed to be playing a joke on them. On the first day of school after the summer vacation, they unexpectedly ran into each other. Neither of them could have imagined that the long-awaited reunion would happen under such circumstances. The words Takao had prepared for so long couldn't come out at that moment. No matter what, Takao learned from his classmates that Yukino was a teacher at their school, and today, she was actually there to handle her resignation. The reason was that a senior high school student had fallen in love with her. When the boy's girlfriend found out, she spread rumors that Yukino was seducing male students at the school. In order to avoid the situation escalating, the school took advantage of Yukino's kindness and pressured her to resign voluntarily. Takao finally learned the whole truth. He also understood where Yukino's sadness had come from. So, he directly confronted the female student who had falsely accused Yukino, and without hesitation, slapped her across the face. But in return, he was beaten up by the older students. Takao didn't give in. He would never allow anyone to tarnish the sacred light that resided in his heart. The next day, the rain still hadn't come, but Takao didn't want to wait any longer. He knew that Yukino needed someone by her side right now. So, he immediately went to the park. He knew Yukino would be there. Yukino was very surprised by Takao's arrival, but Takao simply said to her gently, "If it rains, will you stay with me? But even if it doesn't rain, I will still be here." Suddenly, the clear sky began to thunder. They had finally waited for the rain. The two of them, caught off guard, were drenched by the sudden downpour. To avoid catching a cold, Yukino took Takao back to her apartment. She started ironing his soaked clothes. Meanwhile, Takao, wearing Yukino's t-shirt, made lunch. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the warmth filled the room. At that moment, they forgot all their sadness and worries, and were completely immersed in the happiness of the moment. Takao looked at Yukino before him, unable to suppress the feelings within his heart. Finally, he spoke the words he had buried deep inside. Upon hearing Takao's confession, Yukino froze for a moment. She seemed to have been waiting for Takao to confess, but soon, her expression turned sorrowful. sadness and a sense of loss enveloped her once again, because Yukino knew that she couldn't respond to this love. After all, there was a 12-year age gap between them. Yukino gently rejected Takao and told him that she would be returning to her hometown next week. Takao wasn't surprised by Yukino's rejection. He didn't say anything further. He simply changed back into his own clothes. Yukino, however, felt regret. There were so many things she wanted to say to him, but no matter how hard she tried, the words wouldn't come out. It wasn't until she heard the sound of the door closing as Takao left that an overwhelming sense of loss quickly filled her heart. At that moment, only the tea on the table proved that Takao had been there. Yukino could no longer keep up the facade of calm. She covered her face and began to cry. The warm memories of being with Takao constantly resurfaced in her mind. At that moment, she finally realized that Takao's tender love had already taken root in her heart. In that moment, Yukino finally understood. She decided to face her true feelings. Yukino, barefoot, ran out of her house. She was scared. She was afraid that Takao had already left. Fortunately, Takao had not left. His lonely figure was still standing between the stairs. Watching Yukino appear before him, Takao was so nervous that he could hardly breathe. But he still tried to act as if nothing was wrong. Takao told Yukino to forget what he had just said. He told her that he didn't actually like her. Takao always feels that this affection is just his wishful thinking, and Yukino told him nothing. Not even about her identity, her job, or even her name. Takao grew angrier as he spoke, until his last few words were shouted out loud. In response to what Takao said, Yukino's face was covered in tears. At that moment, she could no longer suppress her love for Takao. She ran to him, hugged him, and cried loudly.
やたちゃんとスーツ着て学校に行こうとしてたの。でも怖くて、どうしても行けなくて、あの場所で私、あなたに救われてたの。
The sunlight scattered the clouds, turning into a blessing, warming the two souls tightly embraced. Now, they no longer longed for rainy days. Yukino returned to her hometown, while Takao continued working hard for his dreams. But the brief separation didn't end their love. As spring passed and winter came, Takao returned to the pavilion where they had first met. He read Yukino's letters over and over again, and the pair of shoes Takao had made for Yukino was now complete. At that moment, a poem from the letter Yukino had written to him appeared in Takao's mind. If one day you can walk farther and steadier, then go see her. Love can transcend age and overcome life and death, but a good love is always the result of effort from both sides. So, if one day you meet the person destined for you, even with all the difficulties, do not be afraid, be brave, move forward, and love without hesitation.